ざいます。レオナルド・トラサンデ先生にお話を伺いたいと思います。トラサンデ先生、どうぞ壇上の方にお越しください。世界にいらっしゃって、現在はニューヨーク大学医学部で環境小児科部門の責任者、小児科研究部門の副部長を務められています。またニューヨーク大学ワーグナー校等でご教鞭をお取りになっています。トラサンデさんは欧州とアメリカにおいて環境ホルモンが原因となって引き起こされている病気の社会的費用が算定されたことで有名で、先ほど中瀬代表からもご紹介ありました通り、子どもの健康と環境の問題について国際的に活躍する気鋭のリーダーでいらっしゃいます。トラサンデ先生は最近シッカーパタファラという、ご本を執筆されたんですけれども、現在日本語版の出版に向けて準備をされているということです。出版されたらぜひ読んでみたいと思いますが、今日はまずその本の内容についてもご紹介いただけるということで楽しみにしております。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
すみません。少し日本語を話します。It's a privilege to be here today to speak about the leading challenge, a challenge that I argue is the second leading environmental challenge that we face today, and it arguably has addressing climate change. So allow me to introduce you first. Sure, of course. This is even better. So some of you may have come to this conversation wondering why we didn't know about endocrine disrupting chemicals. Why are we only learning about this now here at the end of the second decade of the 21st century? A reason for that is that we have experienced a history of using and being an even more productive society through the use of synthetic chemicals in all aspects of life. As you see in the middle of the slide is a cover from Time magazine where a leader in DuPont, a gentleman by the name of Copeland, was a leader in bringing this multinational corporation great profit and great productivity from the introduction and development of plastics. And as you can see on the left and on the right, you can imagine the many benefits that plastics were being presented in the eyes of the public at the time. On the right, you see a newborn baby in a lucite plastic bassinet. Even in my own pediatric training, and still in my clinical career, I see little newborn babies in these plastic bassinets. And at the time, these plastic bassinets brought the promise of easier cleaning, reduction of microbial infections, which can be devastating to a newborn who is just developing an immune system. So there were many benefits that were perceived to be obvious with the introduction of newer chemical products and chemically intensive manufacturing. On the left, you see a plastic cup that offered the benefit of being able to fall on the floor without breaking and an easy cleaning process as well in the process of using that for drinks and even food. So we were brought into the mindset that chemicals were not bad for our health. They actually improve our health and overall well-being. And so that's the mindset in which we come to understanding the effects of chemicals on human lives today. Now, we did have some warnings that chemicals were not all good for us. The woman on the left is really a scientist who I never had the benefit of meeting, on whose shoulders, to borrow a phrase from Albert Einstein, I have the privilege of standing on today in my own research. Rachel Carson was brave when she first described the effects of a pesticide that was used widely. You see a child on a beach somewhere in the United States literally running in the mist of DDT, because the presumption was that this chemical would eliminate malaria, a very deadly vector-borne illness across the world. I had the privilege a few years ago working for then Senator Clinton. She writes about running in this mist herself as a child growing up, and that again was thought to be okay, but we now realize that these chemicals not only affect wildlife, as Rachel described so beautifully in her book Silent Spring, but we now realize that DDT is associated with an increase in humans of a risk for breast cancer. And so this was our first warning sign that there was something potentially wrong with the broad and widespread development of chemicals in our daily life, that it wasn't all for the better for our human health. The second warning flag was more specific. Originally, Carson wrote about the impact of pesticides on our wildlife. The effect of DDT on human health was only described very recently with respect to breast cancer and other consequences. The first warning flag of endocrine disrupting chemicals and their impact on human health came from a pharmaceutical. Diethylstilbestrol was introduced in the 1930s as a synthetic estrogen drug that was a wonder drug because estrogen prolonged pregnancies, prevented prematurity, and was thought to actually improve the symptoms of a mother of nausea and other consequences that come with pregnancy. Now, a few years after diethylstilbestrol was introduced, we realized that it wasn't as effective as previously described. But a few years after that, we realized that there were potential serious consequences associated with the use of this pharmaceutical. A very astute pediatrician and colleagues at the Massachusetts General Hospital described a cluster of young girls who had a cancer that had not been previously described in the history of the hospital or much in the literature at all, an adenocarcinoma of the vagina. And this team did a really wonderful and carefully described study in which they went back to the records of these children and the mothers that delivered these children, and then they matched those young girls with girls of a similar class, obesity profile, and other health information. And the only difference between the girls who developed this rare cancer and the girls who did not develop this rare cancer was the use of this pharmaceutical. This was a remarkable finding at the time. It took this study of 8 young girls, that was how small the study was at the time, to change our thinking fundamentally about the effects of this synthetic pharmaceutical and its impact on people's lives. And the good news is, at the time, that DDT and DES were identified as problems and set aside for their use. DDT is now banned under the Stockholm Convention. It's only used in certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa to prevent malaria in endemic areas. The argument for using DDT in those areas is that the vectors that distribute malaria can't be stopped without the use of DDT, and that's why we see DDT used in those very few places in the world. Similarly, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States banned diethylcholesterol in 1971. Now, these are good examples where science leads to relatively rapid reaction to protect us all. So we thought we were safe again at some level. That is a reasonable understanding based on how we understood the science at the time. And one reason we understood that we were safe is that we have a long history of thinking that the dose is the only thing that makes the poison. The gentleman in the odd picture in the middle is Paracelsus, a Swiss philosopher whose full name is Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheimhorn. That's the only time you'll ever hear me say that. But the reason I bring this Swiss physician's name to this conversation is that his perspective about toxicology is something that has carried the reality for 500 years. He lived in the 1500s. And even until very recently, even when I was a medical student at Harvard in the late 1990s, I was taught this principle. It's analogous to saying everything should be in moderation. A little bit of a poison might not be a problem, but a lot of a poison is a problem. And it's that mindset that pervades much of the conventional thinking across the world. That's why on the right, you see this picture. This comes from an organization called Sense About Science that likes to communicate about the effects of chemicals in our daily lives. And it makes the argument that, well, a little bit of synthetic chemical can't be bad for you because there are toxic natural chemicals in our daily life. And if you have a lot of these toxic natural chemicals, that can hurt you too. So it's about the dose. That's the only thing that makes the poison. So I bring this up to remind us that we've carried forward this paradigm in science for 500 years. And it's a credit, actually, to this gentleman in the middle, Paracelsus, that we've gotten this far. It has withstood the test of time for many, many years. Now, unfortunately, and this is like many scientific phenomena that we deal with, the reality is that we actually were not safe. So the case in point that really brings this issue home is a group of pesticides that were introduced into use in the 1950s in agriculture called organophosphate pesticides. The original thought was that these chemicals basically affected electrical discharges in the brains of roaches and other unwanted creatures in our lives. And because the human brain was more resilient, was able to deal with these low levels of exposure, and the pesticide did not induce these same effects as it did in lower creatures in the food chain, it was okay to use this chemical, this category of chemicals. Now, that was our original understanding, but now over the past 2 decades, we've realized that lower levels of these same chemicals disrupt thyroid hormone, the hormone that is fundamental to our metabolism, our maintaining healthy body temperature, even brain function. And in little newborn babies, thyroid hormone is a very important thing. I'm proud as a pediatrician that from the very first day that I was in the newborn nursery, we would check every baby's heel stick blood. We'd make the baby cry, though it was often not the heel stick, but the holding of the baby that made the baby cry. At least that's what we were told. But we would collect a few drops of blood, and we would test for a variety of genetic conditions, but also check for what we call congenital hypothyroidism. And that's a very treatable condition. It's very satisfying as a pediatrician the few times you identify a child with that concern, because you can give a child thyroid hormone, and you can prevent a child from having a lifetime of intellectual disability. Now, that's a gross dysfunction, a gross mistake in the way a baby's thyroid hormone is produced. And again, like what I said about Paracelsus, we assumed that only gross disruptions in bodily functions induced disease. But now we realize that during pregnancy, a newborn baby relies on mom's thyroid hormone production and function to develop the brain. And that's because the baby doesn't make thyroid hormone until the second trimester of pregnancy. And that disruption of thyroid hormone, even within the normal range of a mother's blood test, that is, if you're an obstetrician, you can't identify which mom is affected. Even subtle shifts in the normal range are associated with cognitive deficits, as well as even autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And that's where these pesticides and other chemicals are so important, because low doses of these chemicals, much lower than the levels that Paracelsus described, can disrupt thyroid hormone in early life. And in human studies, now we have 4 large-scale birth cohort studies in humans that have followed mothers and their children, and all 4 of them tell us the same story, that if you measure a child's cognitive potential at ages, let's say 5 or 6 or 7, the higher the mom's level of these pesticides in her body that she passed to the baby, the lower the child's IQ, or intellectual quotient. It's the lower capacity for a child to produce in society and produce in our economy. And the picture below is a study based at Columbia University that also identified these children to have smaller parts in the brain that are crucial for these same higher order cognitive functions. Parts of the frontal and parietal cortex are smaller in the more highly exposed mothers. And so you have 2 different independent verifications of the same problem, that little things do matter. So we were not as safe as we originally thought. And the same is true, as I've described here, for a category of chemicals that also disrupt the thyroid hormone, called flame retardants, chemicals that are used to stop the spread of fires. They're used in electronics and furniture. So there are a variety of other chemicals in our daily lives, chemicals that you can measure in people's blood or urine in the case of pesticides, that can give you these same kinds of consequences, even at low levels of exposure that we all experience in our daily lives. It's not only the brains of children that are affected by these chemical exposures. We now have evidence that chemicals can also literally make us fatter. There are some 50 so-called chemical obesogens, chemicals that in the laboratory or in humans can make us fatter. Now, nothing I'm about to say means that healthy diet and physical activity are the most important reasons for maintaining a healthy body weight. That's true. There is such a thing as calories in, calories out. But for example, bisphenol A, which is used in the linings of aluminum cans and thermal paper receipts, makes fat cells bigger. It actually tell cells in the body that have not yet decided what form they're going to take to go into fat cells as opposed to muscle or bone cells. It disrupts the function of a protein that protects the heart called adiponectin. And it's a synthetic estrogen, much like DES, but not as potent. BPA was considered as a pharmaceutical back when DES was being brought onto market, but it wasn't potent enough the way DES was. It's an interesting and frightening comparison to make at some level. But that fact that it's a synthetic estrogen means BPA can have sex-specific effects on growth and development, especially during vulnerable windows of development like puberty. So it can literally reshape a developing child into having an unhealthier body composition. We also know that chemicals used in softer plastics, called phthalates, can disrupt how the body processes calories. So let's say you've had a healthy diet with a substantial amount of protein, you've gone for a run, gotten some exercise in. Phthalates can divert the traffic in your body, your metabolism, from making protein from muscle from that protein, and essentially move it into sugar or fat. Now, what's also a concern is that these chemicals can make us sicker, and they make us sicker in a few ways. One way they make us sicker is that phthalates are known to antagonize, inhibit the function of the male sex hormone, testosterone. Testosterone is crucial for sperm production, for libido, but it's not just a lifestyle issue. It, in some cases, is literally a life or death issue. We know that phthalates, by reducing testosterone, can contribute to what's called low testosterone levels. It's a clinical condition that's increasingly being recognized in adult men that is associated with heart disease and even stroke. And in the United States, we found that 10,000 men each year die because phthalates reduce their testosterone, pushing them into a higher risk profile for disease. So literally, this is not just a lifestyle issue, this is a life or death matter in some cases, and that's not making it too dramatic. We also know that when you contribute to disease, when you reduce the cognitive potential of children who are the economic engine of our society, you literally undermine our economic productivity and cost society. We did a series of studies about 5 years ago in which we put together the best experts we could. And we looked first at the costs of endocrine disrupting chemicals, their disease-related costs, first in the European Union and then in the United States. And what we found was shocking. I didn't expect the results that I'm about to describe to you. In Europe, the costs of endocrine disrupting chemicals are 163 billion euros each year. That's 1.2% of the gross domestic product. And as an American, I'm embarrassed by the fact that the costs of these chemicals in the United States are even higher. $340 billion a year. That's 2.3% of our gross domestic product. And so you might ask, well, why is the cost so much higher in the United States? That's because back in the 1970s, we put a law into place that required flame retardant chemicals, those chemicals that disrupt thyroid hormone, into every piece of furniture and upholstery because we wanted to prevent the spread of fires. And so that has produced a situation where if you measure 100 Americans, and I measured everyone else's blood here today, the levels of those who live their lives in Japan would be much lower than Dr. Myers and myself and our blood levels. Maybe I speak for myself and not for Dr. Myers, but suffice it to say that we have had a legacy where we lead the way in the United States in having the highest levels of flame retardants in our bodies of any country in the world. And as a result, our children in the United States are less well able to contribute to society and to our economy. So 240 billion of that $340 billion is due to flame retardants alone. And unfortunately, I have to tell you this, the costs in Japan are likely on the same order of magnitude, maybe not as high as the United States for the reasons I've talked about with flame retardants. But these are chemicals that are detected. Dr. Nakayama-san will talk about the Japan Echo Child Study and its plans to measure these chemicals and what it's already identified. But these are chemicals that are found in every human being on the face of the planet, even the most rural areas of the world where you think these chemicals might not arrive, they arrive there. And yet, the costs to society are based on an estimate of just less than 5% of endocrine disrupting chemicals. A subset of diseases due to the few chemicals we study. And a small part of the whole of all the costs of those diseases due to the few chemicals we study. So this is clearly an underestimate of an underestimate of an underestimate. And yet, it's 1.2 to 2.3% of the gross domestic product. So we really have a problem that we are, for which we are barely touching the tip of an iceberg. Now, there's some good news. We already are starting to become aware, and we must learn this lesson as a public. The first report that really put this scientific issue on the map came from the Endocrine Society, a professional society of 17,000 endocrinologists from across the world. The Endocrine Society is an international organization from over 100 countries with membership. In 2012, on the right, the World Health Organization and the United Nations Environment Program acknowledged that endocrine disrupting chemicals are a global public health threat. In 2015, the Endocrine Society realized that there were 1,331 new scientific publications since the 2009 report, and so they decided to put a second scientific statement out. Most scientific societies don't respond that quickly with scientific statements. And then, I'm privileged to say that doctors are also speaking out. My American Academy of Pediatrics, that I'm proud to be a member of, I'm also a member of the Endocrine Society, in 2018 put a report out documenting the concern about synthetic chemicals that contaminate foods, intentionally through food packaging and unintentionally through other sources. And the International Federation of Obstetricians and Gynecologists has acknowledged this as a major threat. The Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists has acknowledged the need to take safe and simple steps to limit exposure. So there is an opportunity here for us to get the broader word out. I like to say that endocrine disrupting chemicals affect 100% of us. Yet right now, only 1% of us really know that this is an issue. You here in the audience probably represent that 1% today. So we must all rise up. I began this presentation by making a comparison to climate change. And it is not histrionic. It's not extreme to make that comparison. Even if we cool the planet, if we don't address the internal contamination with these synthetic chemicals, we will pass along a legacy in which our children will be sicker, fatter, and poorer. The picture on the left is from an American TV miniseries called The Handmaid's Tale. It's based on a book by Margaret Atwood by the same name from 1984. At the time, she wrote this book. It was fictional, but it was about a population where infertility was such a crisis that a totalitarian regime took over and essentially took women who were fertile and matched them with men who presumably were fertile, with the idea of sustaining the population. And there were other consequences. I'm simplifying the story to a great extent, but that speaks to the urgency of the problem that could be ahead. Literally, we have synthetic chemicals, as Dr. Myers will talk about for sure, that are contributing to a decline in sperm count. These trends have declined across the world, especially in developing countries. So we are facing a primal threat, perhaps not as obvious as wildfires or as other phenomena associated with climate change. But we are seeing the imprints in chronic disease epidemics across the world that are raising the alarm. So what do we do? The great news is that as much as I have perhaps scared you or raised serious concerns, there are safe and simple steps we can all take to limit these exposures. And at the same time, we do need to advocate for policies and changes to limit these exposures of greatest concern. So here are some safe and simple steps that are based in the best available scientific evidence right now. We know, for example, that eating organic in multiple separate studies has consistently and rapidly reduced the levels of pesticides in the urine of young children. These are the same pesticides that I talked about earlier that are disrupting thyroid hormone and contributing to negative effects on the developing brains of young children. Similarly, avoiding canned food consumption has been associated with a steep and rapid decline in levels of bisphenols in the human body. In the United States, a lot of people have talked about replacing BPA and putting labels that say BPA free. There's a problem with that, however, and that's why I suggest avoiding canned foods across the board. A BPA free can often uses bisphenols, other bisphenols. There are 40 or so regrettable substitutes, or in the United States we describe it as artists formerly known as BPA. It's a nod to the rock star Prince. But putting my tongue in my cheek, if you will, I'll just continue on to say that BPS, BPP, BPF, BPZ are among the chemicals of concern. And what little we know about BPS is that it's as estrogenic, as toxic to embryos, and as persistent in the environment. So in many ways, by simply changing BPA for BPS, we are kicking the can, to borrow another idiom, I apologize, down the street. Similarly, we assume that microwavable plastics are safe for use. Unfortunately, that label is misleading because microwave safe really only refers to gross misshaping and warping of plastic. Unfortunately, the synthetic chemicals that are used in plastics are not always bound to the plastic directly. And in fact, they can break down. Polymers do break down into monomers and ultimately get into food and into the human body with the same consequences that I've talked about here today. Now, the message here is also about reducing the use of plastic fundamentally. We have a crisis of ecological and drastic proportions when it comes to the plastic that's in our water, in our fish, and in our daily lives, that are essentially waste that has disseminated throughout the planet. Reducing the use of plastic helps reduce your exposure to chemicals used in plastic and also supports a broader problem that we are fighting. Finally, the good news is there are steps to reduce exposure to flame retardants and other persistent organic pollutants. Simply recirculating the air by opening the windows or using a wet mop can get rid of flame retardants and other chemicals of concern. I perhaps don't need to focus as much in this audience on the flame retardants because this is largely an American problem. But in case you are concerned, there are even steps with older furniture to limit the exposure because the chemicals are sprayed directly into the upholstery of the furniture. So if it's torn or scratched, it's either time to get rid of that piece of furniture or to cover it with an appropriate slipcover. And just one comment about the effects of these endocrine disrupting chemicals that disrupt thyroid hormone. Iodine is a problem from the perspective of deficiency and can magnify the effects of these chemicals of concern. And it affects 2 billion people worldwide. So having a diet healthy in iodine can partly stem the problem that we're talking about here today. Not to mention using a wet mop, vacuuming regularly, and limiting dust contamination from other persistent organic pollutants. Now, I hear a lot about the cost of these safer alternatives. I work at a public hospital called Bellevue Hospital in New York City that serves low-income populations across New York City as a pediatrician. And when I talk about this, people look at me like I'm weird because they think that these steps are only for the rich or those with substantial resources. But we all can succeed in reducing these exposures, and the economic benefits of preventing these exposures do actually often outweigh the costs. So a lot of people also say to me, well, if I substitute out these chemicals in my product, I won't be able to make a profit. That's just not the reality. The reality is when you push for safer alternatives, you create a market for innovation. And you create opportunities for new companies to come in and make the safer alternatives at much lower costs. So here's an example that really brings this point home. So we did a study looking at a hypothetical scenario. In the United States, we use BPA still in a lot of aluminum cans. And an alternative that is, at least based on what we know, free of health effects is called oleoresin. It costs 2.2 cents on the can. If you replaced it in all the cans in the United States, it would cost roughly $2.2 billion. Now, what if you were able to get BPA out right away? You would reduce levels of BPA enough so that you would reduce childhood obesity substantially and adult cardiovascular disease, based on current knowledge. There are other disease consequences associated with these chemicals that may also be reduced. If you just focus on those two disease outcomes I mentioned at the beginning, the reduction in disease costs would be on the order of $1.7 billion. That's almost the same as the cost of the safer alternative. And that doesn't even consider all the other disease endpoints that have been associated with BPA, like cognitive effects, breast cancer, among other consequences. And when you look at some of the uncertainties in our own estimates of the benefits, there actually are scenarios where the benefits could actually be even on the order of $13 billion a year, almost sixfold the economic costs that we're talking about. So as much as people say that safer alternatives are costly, the economic benefits in the short and long term can actually outweigh the costs. The other piece of the story that people don't talk about is that we have already succeeded in some very substantial ways in reducing endocrine disrupting chemical exposures. In the United States, we got BPA banned in baby bottles and sippy cups in 2008. This is almost a decade ago. And that was not just because of the science. There was science at the time. But what we had at the time was a lot of public awareness. You were hearing about bisphenol A on the Today Show and other media outlets. And that attention made the companies that make these baby bottles and sippy cups, they don't make the chemicals, they make the baby bottles and sippy cups. They went to their providers of the raw materials and said, change your ways. They changed their ways, and the companies then ran to the US Food and Drug Administration and insisted on a ban to reassure the public. So that's an example where consumer action can actually drive the change that we seek as a result of what science tells us is a problem. More recently, there are a group of chemicals called the Perfluoroalkyl Substances. They're what we call the forever chemicals because they stay in the body for years. They're used in non-stick cooking materials. They're also used in water repellent and oil repellent fabrics. It took just the study of 5 food packages to get 2 major supermarket chains to get the PFAS out of the face-out food packaging. And more recently, a major company, a German-based company that is heavily operating in the northeast of the United States, Ahold Delhaize, has promised to get PFAS out of all of its materials, not just the face-out food packaging. That's a very public statement that was not driven by some regulatory agency. And it speaks to the fact that even when the government may not be aligned with the message and the problem and really understand the stakes that are involved, that public movements can support the actions that are needed. So I see a lot of hope. I don't see sadness the way some might think that I do. I'm not generally an optimist either. So this should pass along a reassuring message. And I have reason for that. In that the millennials and the post-millennials have really opened up a conversation about environmentalism that we didn't even think about 5 years ago. And it's largely Greta Thunberg who has led the way in that respect on climate change. And there's something interesting about climate change and endocrine disruption that has a common force behind it. So fossil fuel production drives the raw materials for plastics just as it drives climate change. And the same is true when it comes to fossil fuels, which are the feedstock for many endocrine disrupting chemicals. And so if we address climate change, we actually will address part of the endocrine disrupting chemical problem. But there's something bigger than that that's the point I'm trying to make. And that is that we have an opportunity to have a broader conversation because of the discussion and the concern by the younger generations about climate change. So with no offense to the audience, we need to go out and focus on the youngest generation who might be focused on manga or other activities or what have you, but they care about these issues and they want to hear about what's affecting their health and their lives. They've already been primed for this message, and that's a real opportunity that gives me substantial hope. So with that, arigato for the opportunity to present. I'm privileged to say that much like the legacy of Barstool and Future, we're hopeful that my book on endocrine disrupting chemicals called Sicker, Fatter, Poorer will soon be translated into Japanese. The plans are well underway. So I look forward to your comments and questions.
ありがとうございました。